Great. Welcome everyone to our final class on Nagarjuna's letter to a friend. We're going to start with prayers as usual. And if Jana would like to lead us in those, that would be wonderful. Let me get them on the screen and get enough of this stuff cleared out of the way so you can actually see them in the screen here in the compound. Okay.
Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. We'll do 3 times in English.
To the founder, the endowed, transcendent, destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroying, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge.
Short mandala offering, and we're doing it in Tibetan tonight. Saji po ki ju shin me ta tra ri ra li chi ri de gan pa di sangye ji du me de Wali Roku no Daji Cho Sho Ida Ratna Mandala Kamyayatayami. Refuge in bodhicitta, once in English, twice in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodam Soki Choknam Pa Janchu Bardu Dakni Kapsuchi Daki Chanyan Gi Pe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Druparsho Sangye Chodam Soki Choknam Pa Janchu Bardu Dakni Kapsuchi Daki Chanyan Gi Pe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Druparsho.
Okay, let's do a short meditation. Give ourselves a chance to come into the space and focus our minds a bit. And you can use the breath as your meditation object for this first few minutes, just using it in whatever technique you prefer, and try to keep the awareness with the breath. Whenever the mind wanders, gently guide the mind back to the breath. And then after a few minutes of this, I'll come in and lead you in setting our motivation for tonight's session. So tonight, let's set our motivation of bodhicitta in a bit more formal way. First, by visualizing all sentient beings surrounding us. Of course, this is a pretty immense visualization that we probably can't do perfectly. But begin by visualizing the beings that are very close to you in this life. Kind of in the space immediately behind you and to either side. Those beings who you have an affection for. And then in the space before you, you can visualize the beings that are problematic for you in your life. And we might call these enemies, but it's beings who have done something that has harmed us, or those that we love, or perhaps we're just opposed to them in general. Maybe even because of their political views or other things that they do that are upsetting for us. So those two groups we have a more defined relationship with. But in the space surrounding these two are all other sentient beings who are strangers to us. We haven't yet connected with them in a way that they become either a friend or a difficult person. But they are part of the scope of this mind of bodhicitta that we want to be sure to include. So again, we might not have faces for this group, but this sea of sentient beings going out in all directions. You can visualize all beings in human form. This is a huge amount of beings that we're trying to hold our awareness of as we go about the steps in cultivating bodhicitta. So first, develop a sense of even-mindedness towards them. And we'll do this very briefly tonight. This is actually quite a full meditation that we can do, but here, just think about the fact that there's nothing fixed about these relationships. We like to think our friends are always going to be our friends. The difficult people are always going to be difficult. Perhaps even the strangers will always be in that category. But everything is impermanent and changing. And the beings for which we have attachment now as our friends could become our worst enemies. These things happen within a lifetime as well as from life to life. So we have to hold an even regard for all of them, an equal attitude, trying not to hold some of them closer than others, but to look upon all these beings as equally worthy of our love and compassion. And then think about the fact that it said that every one of these beings has actually in one lifetime or another, perhaps many lifetimes, been very, very close to you, given you unbelievable kindness and support, especially as your own dear mother. We have a mother every life that we're born, from the womb or in an egg. We need a being to play that role for us. And the Buddha says every being has been your mother. And moreover, has shown you incredible kindness, taking care of you at a time when you were very vulnerable. Generate a wish to repay that kindness. And how shall we repay it? First, by helping sentient beings to achieve the happiness they seek, generating what we call great love, the love that embraces all beings equally and wants all of them to achieve the greatest state of happiness, and moreover is dedicated to helping them to do that. And then the mind of compassion, wishing all beings to be free from suffering. Whether they're friends, enemies, strangers, they're all suffering in some way. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they were free from that? If all beings were free. And again, dedicate yourself to freeing them, to protecting them from suffering. And then we make an even stronger motivation, thinking, even if I have to do this by myself alone, I will free all sentient beings from suffering, and I will place them in perfect happiness. And that leads to the question, well, how will I do that? I can't do that in my current state. I'm simply not qualified. But if I become a Buddha, then I can work effortlessly, spontaneously, for the welfare of all sentient beings, with an omniscient mind and the ability to help every one of them exactly in accord with their own predisposition. So set this motivation of bodhicitta that wishes to become a Buddha, to place all beings in happiness and free them all from suffering, to help them to become fully enlightened through our having become enlightened ourselves. Okay, you can open your eyes fully and we'll start the class. So I decided to introduce that more formal meditation on bodhicitta. It's one of the two techniques that are used to develop bodhicitta, and then you can even combine them into a third technique. That one, again, is our sevenfold cause and effect meditation. That's because we are going to be talking about the Mahayana path tonight. That's part of we've been discussing it in some detail throughout this course, but tonight is a very specific part where we do look at the Mahayana motivation, and there's not a lot of teachings within it, so I'm just doing a little introduction in some ways to that. Recall that in our last class we covered a number of topics, the last of which was the 12 links of dependent origination or dependent arising. And I kind of skirted over this second verse in that section, but I thought it would be good to cover that tonight, maybe as a way of reviewing it to some degree. But once more, it's a very complex teaching, and I will be happy to do it at another time when we have more time. But let's just go through what is said in verse 112 of Nagarjuna's text. First, from Venerable Randawa, it says the following verse is stated to illustrate that through contemplating dependent origination with the attributes explained above, one will see the true nature of dharmas, will come to see the reality of things as empty of inherent existence, which is what we ideally want to see to free ourselves and from all of our suffering, but moreover to become a Buddha to benefit others. So verse 112 says, this dependent origination is the most cherished and profound treasure of the Jinna's speech, the conqueror's speech, the Buddha's speech. Whoever is able to see this sees Buddha, supreme knower of reality, because we often refer to the Buddha as essentially being the Dharmakaya. The Dharmakaya is the full fruition of the mind of a sentient being into the state of Buddhahood. And one of the qualities of it is that it's never separated from the wisdom realizing emptiness. So it is in that state of perpetually being focused on the lack of inherent existence of all phenomena, while of course simultaneously being aware of all of conventional reality and acting in accord with the needs of sentient beings perfectly. But when we talk about a Buddha, we're essentially talking about that being who's in that state of complete perfect realization of emptiness. So we want to realize emptiness to move in that direction. Again, it is the wisdom realizing emptiness that allows us to attain our own liberation, but moreover allows us to remove completely all the obscurations in the mind that will bring forth Buddhahood. You know, there are many other factors that contribute to that, but the primary one is the realization of emptiness. So dependent origination, I think I've talked about this topic before. When we went through last week, was what are called the 12 links, which again, it's often depicted as the wheel of life, this outer rim where there are 12 factors that all contribute to us taking rebirth in samsara. But dependent origination is bigger than that. I mean, that is one causal process. And when we talk about the 12 links of dependent origination, it's a wonderful meditation, but it feeds into the understanding of dependent arising, dependent origination, which they say is the best way to realize emptiness. Why? Because when we see that things have a dependent existence, that they arise in dependence upon other factors, causes and conditions in terms of the 12 links, even that alone is enough to show that they lack inherent or independent existence. When we refer to emptiness as a lack of independent existence, then when we show that things have dependent existence, it's totally in line, right? If things have dependent existence, well, then they cannot have independent existence. Now, what we mean by independent existence is that things are able to set themselves up. They have their own identity that through the force of that establishes what they are. Well, no, they're not established in that way. They're established through causes and conditions. Various causes and conditions give rise to certain things that are then, a life or a mind or a body or whatever the case might be. The second way that we talk about dependent origination is in terms of dependence upon parts. Everything has parts, both spatial parts, physical parts, or temporal parts. There's nothing that is partless. And so when we come to understand that, for example, this body has many parts, infinite parts, we could say, because you could go down to minuscule parts, right? That would be even parts of parts of parts of parts. But the idea is that when we see that there is all this collection of parts, that is kind of a multitude of parts, and yet we are talking about a single whole, which is the body. Well, that shows that, again, the body has some dependence upon those parts to come into existence. Without those parts, we cannot designate the whole. The whole depends upon its parts. This is the reality for everything, again, that exists, either physical, spatial parts, or temporal parts. And that kind of leads us into the third and subtlest level of dependent origination, which is where we understand that when it comes down to it, these parts of the body, for example, are simply a basis for designating body, for labeling this as body. There's no real body here. Body is a designation we give to this collection of stuff. Each of us has our own body that we refer to as body, and we think there's a real body here. But there's not a real body here. There is a designation of body that is a conventional term that we use in our language. In English, we use the word body. It would be different in different languages. But this is how we are referring to this phenomenon. It's simply labeled as body. There's no real body here. The parts become basis of designation for body that we all agree are going to be called body, and we label it as such. There's nothing more than that. There's nothing more than that in regard to the I, in regard to any phenomenon that we choose. It's merely designated, merely labeled. They say when we get to that subtlest level, that third level of dependent origination, it opens up the opportunity to realize emptiness much more quickly. Because when we again see that things don't have anything from their own side that establishes them, they're merely designated by the mind, well, then they can't exist independently or inherently. What is a body without somebody designating it as body? Does it have the label body from its own side? Well, then we wouldn't even have to learn terms or labels for anything that exists. We'd see it when we're a baby and we'd go, oh, that's a body. Oh, that's a chair. That's a TV, whatever. Well, we know that this isn't the case, right? We learn the terminology. We learn what things are, how are referring to them. They don't have any inherent identity. But they actually say all three of these levels do point to emptiness of independent existence because they're all three levels of dependence. Dependence upon causes and conditions, which this body also has causes and conditions involved in it, right? The initial two causes, main causes, substantial causes of the two cells from our parents, the egg and the sperm that united in the womb of our mother. And then, of course, all the cooperative conditions, the warmth of the womb, the nourishment that our mothers took into their bodies that fed us as, fetuses growing in the womb, and everything else that has contributed to the health of this body, this body continuing to exist since the body initially was formed out of those two cells that were somebody else's body. They came from someone else's, two other people's body. So again, just arising from causes and conditions is enough to show that things can't exist on their own, independent, but they also depend upon parts, and they also, of course, depend upon us labeling those parts, that basis, as whatever it is that we agree to call things. There's no real I, there's no real body in the sense that we mistakenly think there is, that things are able to set themselves up. So that's why this is being mentioned here. I thought, again, I'd go over this a little bit because this is a little bit different than just looking at the 12 links, and I kind of, again, skirted over it. So whoever sees this, whoops, sorry, how we got there, get out of here. What happened here? I didn't, just if I click on that, that should go away. Okay. So this is again pointing to the fact that this is how we become a Buddha, is by seeing emptiness through the teachings on dependent arising. This is one of Lama Tsongkhapa's most precious teachings. He says, thus, This dependent origination is the most cherished of all the Jina speech, because it is the essential meaning of all the holy words. It's what the whole Buddha's teachings are driving towards, is to realize the dependent nature of all things so that we then can realize emptiness, and that will unlock samsara for us. It will allow us to attain nirvana. It will allow us to attain Buddhahood. It is profound in the sense that it is difficult for others to comprehend, being free of the four extremes. I'm not going to go into detail on the four extremes. There's a passage in Geshe Sopa's book, but these four extremes are a way of saying that things can't arise in an inherently existent way. They don't arise from an inherently existent self, other, both self and other, or neither, causelessly. Things do arise. They don't arise from something that's inherently the same as them, something that's inherently different from them. This is the nature of things. They're just things arising from this process of causes and conditions, and us labeling it at this at that point, that at another point, and it transforms into something else. It gets a third name, whatever. Whoever comes to a correct realization of dependent origination sees the Buddha, the supreme knower of reality. For the Buddha consists of the Dharmakaya, whose nature is not different from that of dependent origination, not different from that of emptiness. This is essentially what we mean, is this mind of a Buddha that is empty of inherent existence itself, that is in continual realization of emptiness. As the Salastamba Sutra states, whoever knows dependent origination knows the Dharma. He who knows the Dharma knows the Tathagata, knows the Buddha. So this is, again, just a nice little way to move from that into the remaining topics. We have a few more complex topics to look at, but maybe not as complex, certainly, as the 12 links are. The following verse is stated to demonstrate that one who has a thorough understanding of dependent origination will give rise to the path focused upon the four Arya truths. So this is the idea that, again, when we start to learn about dependent origination, certainly the 12 links as well, that we then start to practice a path that will lead to the attainment of the result of nirvana, enlightenment. Remember that when we first got into this whole section about attaining nirvana, I didn't give a sort of introduction to this section, because remember, we talked about the faults of samsara, and then we are now in the whole section that's about the benefits of nirvana and how we go about attaining that. Well, these are kind of primarily Hinayana teachings that we're looking at. We usually talk about nirvana and just keep it at just the word nirvana. We're usually talking about individual liberation. So some of the teachings we're going to go through in this section are much more geared at those practitioners who are on the individual liberation path, who are either what we call hearers or solitary realizers, these beings who are destined to free themselves from their own samsara, which is a very noble goal. It's a wonderful thing, one less suffering sentient being in samsara. But the Mahayana, the Bodhisattvas go beyond that. They don't want to simply practice a path that leads to their own release from samsara. They want to attain Buddhahood so they can help others to do that work as well. So again, these teachings are a little bit geared at the practitioner of the individual vehicle, the person who wants to attain their own nirvana. So that's why we start off with what are called the Eightfold Noble Path. Now, again, it's not to say that these things are not practiced in the Mahayana, but this is perhaps a bit more common presentation within like the Theravadan tradition and some of the other, more kind of Hinayana teachings, if you will. The Eightfold Arya Path is set out in verse 113, but it's kind of interesting. It's in a weird order, not the order that they're normally set out. You'll get an explanation of that in a moment. Right view, livelihood, effort, recollection, samadhi, speech, activity, and right conceptualization or thought are the 8 limbs of the path. Meditate upon them in order to attain peace. So these are often set out. I even have a little book that, let me take it off screen for a moment so those that online can see as well. I think it's got a different cover now, but anyway, 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness by your teacher. You've had teachings, Mary Jo, right? With Bhante and Napola Gunaratana. Yes. And so it's a wonderful book, and it's primarily from the Theravadan tradition, looking at these eightfold Noble Path. And as I said, it's highlighted primarily in the Hinayana teachings, but it's also part and parcel of what we practice in the Mahayana, just with, again, a different motivation. Let's go through the explanation of these 8. I might mention before we go into them that many of you know of the Dharma chakra, which here is the symbol that's often at the entranceway into Dharma centers and monasteries. There is the 8-spoked wheel. Those 8 spokes represent the Eightfold Path. And of course, this is one of the main teachings the Buddha gave after attaining enlightenment and teaching on the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths is the very next topic that we're going to go into after the Eightfold Path. So we're going to go through the explanation that's given here. Know that in the book I mentioned, 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness, there's much more detail and there's a slightly different presentation on some of these. But they're really, again, a key part of the practice that leads to one's own liberation. For the sake of meter, the path's limbs are enumerated out of order. So that's the reason why we have them in this weird order. The proper order is as follows. The first 2, right view and right conceptualization, are said to belong to the higher training of wisdom. We often talk about 3 higher trainings that are essential for attaining liberation. We've touched on these before and come across them in the text a number of times. The third one is usually wisdom, but in this presentation, it starts with some level of wisdom because you have to be exposed to the teachings of the Buddha to some degree to begin the whole practice of them. But here we're talking quite specifically about the wisdom that is first realized on the path of seeing and then continues on the path of meditation, which again is the 4th of these 5 paths that lead to either liberation or enlightenment. Right view is wisdom which makes a thorough examination of the object realized in the path of seeing, which, as we know, is emptiness primarily, though there are many other things that are realized as part of that. Right conceptualization or thought is conceptualization which gives rise to speech, indicating to others what one has realized. Now, right conceptualization or thought can include a number of things. And in the book, 8 Mindful Steps, it actually refers primarily to things like loving kindness and compassion. But that's kind of the force by which one then indicates to others what you've realized through correct view. Through your correct understanding of emptiness on the path of seeing, you want to be able to express that to others so that they then can achieve the same realization. So those are both part of our wisdom aspect, our wisdom training. The next 3, which are right speech, right activity, and right livelihood, are all part of our practice of morality. We've already encountered these before in terms of behavior of our body and speech and mind, but moreover, they added to this right livelihood because it's also important that we attain our resources in a way that isn't harmful to others. Right speech is presented here as true and exact verbal expression generated by right conceptualization. So it's kind of like once you have some deep understanding, a correct view of things, and kind of an ability to conceptualize how to convey that to others, your speech should be in accord with that. Now, again, in 8 Mindful Steps, they include all of the aspects of correct speech, which would be not lying, not speaking divisively, not speaking harshly, not speaking meaninglessly. All these kinds of things are entailed in that too. But here, because it's a presentation about what happens on the path of meditation after having realized emptiness on the path of seeing, the whole idea is that we want to be able to correctly convey that to others through the right conceptualization, and then the exact verbal expressions that will help others to achieve the same realization. Right activity, it's kind of interesting here. They say the physical and verbal expression of one who has abandoned wrongdoing. But it's primarily referring to physical activity. Again, the verbal expression would be more included in right speech. I'm not sure why that includes both there. But obviously, we need correct physical activity too, not do things that are out of line with what we have realized, and the wrongdoing that we want to abandon. Right livelihood is a manner of subsistence through food, clothing, and so forth, which is in accord with the Dharma. I might take it off screen and just do a very short kind of talking about this. I think we did encounter right livelihood earlier, though, in this text, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But recall that in this book, I think I mentioned at that time when I went through it, that there is actually an investigation as to our livelihood that's useful for us to do. We should ideally be getting our livelihood, the resources that we need through a paycheck or whatever,
from livelihood that is kind of in accord with the morality, the ethics that the Buddha teaches. Which means the very first investigation is the job that I do or the business that I'm involved in harmful? Does it cause harm to other beings? Am I like, part of a pest control company? Even if you're the accountant that's doing their books, you are working for a company that is about killing sentient beings, what have you. We should probably avoid that type of work. The second one is it something that causes us to break our vows? And of course, the most fundamental vows of Buddhism are the 5 lay vows that many of you hold, to not kill, to not steal, to not engage in inappropriate sexual behavior. Hopefully your job doesn't involve that. And fourth, to not lie. Lying actually is a part of a lot of people's jobs, right? You actually, are encouraged to lie, to deceive customers or whoever so that you're not telling them the whole story. And then the fifth one is to avoid alcohol and intoxicants. If your job is one where you have to engage in breaking your vows and kind of going against the grain of your moral behavior that you want to uphold, well, then it's probably not a good job either. But the third one is kind of interesting. Let me actually use his words because it's quite nice the way that he put it together. He says, let me find it here. I should have marked the page. I do have these all marked, but I don't know for sure the right one. Here, it's the next one after that. Okay. He says, at the third level, finally, we ask whether other factors related to the job make it difficult for the mind to settle down. That's kind of interesting, because again, we don't want to be, engaged in work that causes our minds to be kind of disrupted and discursive, and like everything all over the place, like pinball machine mind. You actually want a job where you can kind of go to work and have things somewhat contained so that you do your work and you don't come home with a zillion things to think about and lie awake all night wondering if you got this done or that done or what memos you need to write the next day or whatever. Now, if you find that your work fits into the category of being any of these 3 things, it's harmful to beings, it is going to cause you to break your vows, or it's really disruptive to your mind, well, then investigate and see if there's something you can do to change things within that. Might not be in some cases because that's the nature of the business, but try to find work that is in accord with that. Especially the first one, because if we are engaged in getting our livelihood from things that are non-virtuous, weaponry. Look at, we got Los Alamos down the road here, right? Many people work in the lab and they are contributing to the creation of nuclear weapons, right? It's what they do up there. It's not a great job to be involved in, right? Because you are a part of that, regardless of what your particular role is. You might not be Oppenheimer, right? Doing the actual work of designing it and whatever, but you're contributing, right? So that's just one thing I wanted to point out because often we don't talk about livelihood in Tibetan Buddhism quite as much. But I think it is important that we try to get our resources to sustain our life from good places. The last 3 of these Eightfold Path, are all pertaining to concentration, the higher training of concentration. So again, these 3 higher trainings are usually set out as morality as the foundation. Then concentration can be built upon good morality. And then eventually we develop deep wisdom on the basis of concentration. But they're put in this order again because we need some level of wisdom to even start the path, and they become a bit of a circle. That's why the 8 are spokes of a circle, of the Dharma wheel. I'm going to go through these real quickly. Right exertion is right effort and meditation on the path, right? We need that effort, that enthusiasm for that practice in particular. Right recollection or mindfulness is not forgetting aspects of the path which are objects of one attention. We have to be mindful, not just in our meditation on the object we're meditating on, but throughout our day. Mindfulness is a very key thing in Buddhism, especially around developing concentration. And then right samadhi, or meditative stabilization, concentration, is remaining fixed one-pointedly upon these objects, not forgetting the objects, meditating on them with single-pointed focus. These 8 factors, which occur during the path of meditation, are called the 8 limbs of the path because they are components and elements of the Arya path. So again, they're often presented as essentially referring to the true paths. We're going to get to the 4 Noble Truths. They are the last truth. that the Buddha taught, the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. This is how we accomplish it, is through the 3 higher trainings and the more specific limbs that I just set out. Of these 8, right view is the limb of ascertainment, ascertaining things correctly, for it ascertains the true nature of things, tattva, again, their emptiness, as it was experienced during a state of composure and meditation. Because it gives rise to speech, which is based on one's own realization, right conceptualization is the limb which provides understanding for others. So as I said, this is a bit of a unique presentation to look at these 2, right view or understanding and right conceptualization or thought, that this is quite specific here around the realization of emptiness that's occurred. You have that correct wisdom that is realizing it, and then the correct thinking about it as to how you are going to present that to others. We can understand emptiness conceptually, all of us, through investigating dependent arising, as was said, investigating the other techniques for realizing emptiness. But, to get the actual taste of emptiness in meditative equipoise, as it's called, is, that first one on the path of seeing, you come out of it with a very different, you are realizing emptiness conceptually before, but the experience, they say, I don't know this myself, but they say it is so profound, and it changes, in a sense, your whole perspective of things. And the way that you know it then, in a direct manner, is difficult to convey to other beings. If it could be conveyed easily, we would get it through all of our lamas, right? They'd be just sitting in front of us and saying, this is exactly what emptiness is like. And we go, oh, wow, that's what it's like. Instead, we have to struggle and go through all the, analyses and realize emptiness through all these processes and what have you. So it is difficult, I think, when you come out of the path of seeing, then to conceptualize how to put into words what this is. Anyway, that's just how I'm taking away from this text and the way it's talking about it. As I said, usually right conceptualization or thought entails a number of other things, including loving kindness and compassion and all these other wonderful qualities. So that, again, is the limb that provides understanding for others. The 3 of right speech, and that would include right action or activities and right livelihood, are the limbs, the 3 limbs, which instill respect in others. We're going to see this coming up in a verse. There are kind of these different categories, 4 categories. The first 2 was the limb of ascertainment and the limb that provides understanding. Then these 3, right speech and so on, that are part of the foundation of good morality, these are called the limbs which instill respect in others. Of these, right speech, through a dialogue of questions and answers, brings others to the realization that one's morality is absolutely pure. Through the practitioner seeking clothing and so forth in an open manner, right livelihood brings others to respect that livelihood as being absolutely pure. Now, right action is missing here, but I would think it would be the same thing. Through your actions being in accord with the Dharma, then they will help others to see through your example, to respect that way of acting in the world. Then we have the last 3. These 3, right exertion is the limb which purifies the mental affliction obstructions, for it is through generating effort that one eliminates any remaining bonds. Recollection or mindfulness is the limb which purifies the obscurations of the secondary mental afflictions. So all 3 of these have to do with mental afflictions, because that's what's suppressed to some degree when we are in concentration. So this one purifies the obscurations of the secondary mental afflictions, because by not forgetting the characteristics of correct shamatha, calm abiding, one prevents the secondary mental afflictions of mental dimness or dullness and excitement from arising, right? Those are both secondary afflictions. So by having a mindfulness that doesn't allow those to arise, we have lessened those secondary afflictions. Then the third one, correct samadhi or meditative stabilization, concentration, is the limb which purifies obscurations to the extraordinary virtues, allowing our virtues to take root, no longer being kind of hindered by afflictions, because it brings the achievement of supernormal wisdom and so forth. Okay, so to sum these up, we have a little verse. These 8 limbs are described in the scripture Madhyanta Vibhaga, which and it says that which ascertains, that's again correct view, that which provides understanding, correct conceptualization or right conceptualization, the three which instill respect in others, which are the three of morality, speech, actions, and livelihood, and then the three antidotes to the adversities. And those are the three that pertain to concentration, our effort or exertion, our mindfulness, recollection, and then of course our samadhi or concentration itself. These are the antidotes to the things that are adverse to that we develop when we're developing calm abiding, those antidotes. These are the 8 limbs of the path. Okay. The 8 should therefore be meditated upon in order to attain peace or nirvana. So again, in the initial sutra, we talk about 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma, and that first turning of the wheel of Dharma started with the Four Noble Truths Sutra. And one of the main teachings that the Buddha expounded upon was this Eightfold Noble Path. And even in the first teaching, that first discourse, that's how he set out the path. And we're going to look now at the essential teachings of that first teaching, the first discourse that the Buddha gave. By the way, we have another Buddhist holiday coming up. We had Sakadawa last Thursday. 49 days later, I believe it is. I can't remember the exact number, but anyway, that's when we celebrate the first wheel turning of the Buddha, which is another one of these big Buddha days. So that'll be coming up sometime soon. This is the essence of what the Buddha taught throughout his entire career, was the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths I'm not going to go into great detail on because I think most of you have had teachings on them, but nonetheless, we'll go through them well enough to be able to talk about them some. The 4 Arya or Noble Truths, this word noble or Arya, again, this is referring to beings who've had that direct insight into emptiness, who can see these truths in a much more profound way than what we can. But we can still study them and come to understand them. First Noble Truth, all that arises is dukkha or suffering. We use this term suffering for it, but we'll talk about what we mean by that shortly. Second Noble Truth, craving is its vast origination, the causes of dukkha. And highlighted here is craving, but there are many other factors that contribute. Third Noble Truth, the truth of cessation. Its cessation is liberation. You can have an end to your dukkha, your suffering, your dissatisfaction. You can get rid of all the causes of it. And then the path for attaining this, the fourth Noble Truth, is the Eightfold Arya Path, as I just mentioned. So the arising of the 5 grasping aggregates is suffering, dukkha. As stated in a sutra, in short, the 5 grasping aggregates are suffering. So let me take it off screen and talk about that. I mean, essentially what we're getting at here is the subtlest level of dukkha or suffering, which is the fact that as long as we are under the control of our karma and delusions and keep taking birth again and again, appropriating aggregates as they're called. The aggregates, we can divide them, there are usually 5 set out, but let's just put them in the 2 categories. You have a physical aggregate, your body, and then you have several mental aggregates, which is the mind. So body and mind, you kind of acquire, to some degree, a coarser level of mind. You have a continuity of mind that runs through all your rebirths. But like, for example, if we were born as an animal, if we had that misfortune of being born as an animal, we know that an animal's consciousness is very different than a human's, just by observing them, right? We can see what they do with their lives, and what they kind of do with their minds. Not that we know it directly, but essentially you appropriate a new mind in terms of a grosser consciousness and a new body. And this is through the force of our karma. Again, the 12 links that we talked about spells out that process. We create an action together with our ignorance, and all of these various things happen, and we end up taking rebirth after rebirth after rebirth. That's what's often called pervasive conditioned suffering. But there are 2 other levels of suffering that are included in that are just what we experience that are evidence of that we're not in a satisfactory situation. One is what we often call suffering. It's the suffering of pain or dukkha of pain. Very easy to see that as suffering, right? Most beings will, clearly want to be separated from that. The second one is often called the dukkha of change. Well, it's referring to the pleasant experiences we have that most people don't see as dukkha at all. They don't see them as unsatisfactory. This is an analysis we can do quite easily, right? And I won't go into great detail, but everything pleasurable we experience cannot ultimately satisfy. And it will actually, when we continue to experience it, it frequently leads to a change in that experience to pain. The one that I often use as an example is like when you were really young and you went to your first birthday party, and there were all these cupcakes there, right? You know, with all the big frosting, that horrible icky frosting now. I mean, I'm giving a value judgment on that, but anyway, you know, and so maybe like this is like, wow, look at all these cupcakes. And so you ate one, you know, and you go, oh, that was good. I'm gonna have another one, you know. And by the time you get to like the third or fourth one, you know, you start feeling you're gonna get sick or something. You didn't get more happiness from those cupcakes, right? The more you ate, it actually became painful. So it's not in the nature of bringing you real happiness. It's a temporary experience. It feels good to eat a cupcake after you've been craving, you know, all that sugar and whatever prior to it. But then if you continue to do it, it leads you down the wrong pathway. Of course, we, as adults, we get very good at moderating things, right? You know, I'm only going to do so much of that because I know it gets really annoying after a while. Right? You can't listen to the same piece of music a zillion times, right? Try it. Put your favorite song on, put it on repeat, and just hang out for a few hours with that same song again and again and again. It might be entertaining a few times. After a while, you're going to want to rip the stereo out of the wall or something, right? Okay. So these are kind of the way that we can begin to see things as they are. And we have to see that we are caught up in something that is actually a prison. We are in the prison of samsara. And we've been in it since beginningless time. And we've been totally preoccupied with making our prison cell really nice, you know, just trying to get all the good things, all the delightful, wonderful things that make us convinced that it isn't really too bad being in samsara. Well, most of us don't even see it as samsara. I mean, outside of, you know, circles where you learn this, like we're doing tonight, we have to begin to see that it's unsatisfactory. This is not a good place to be. That's the first noble truth. The truth of dukkha or suffering needs to be realized or understood. We need to see it for what it is. Let's go back to the text for the second one, the truth of the origin of dukkha, the source of dukkha, the cause of dukkha. Craving, attachment to the impure aggregates is the origination of this suffering. Now, the Buddha, even in the very first noble truth, first discourse, when he taught on the Four Noble Truths, he used craving as the most direct cause of our pain and suffering and what have you. And it makes some sense because we have this fundamental desire to get what we want and to avoid what we don't want. And that leads us down this pathway of creating all kinds of problems and difficulties. I mean, there's a fundamental desire for happiness and to be free from suffering, and the Buddha never faulted that. He never said, oh, get rid of any desire for happiness or suffering and you'll be fine. He said, you got to find the right way to achieve this happiness and freedom from suffering. And having craving and attachment is not the right way. It only leads you down a path of creating more suffering. So there is a way to achieve happiness and freedom from suffering. It's just that we're misguided in how we do that. And that's primarily because craving and anger and all the other afflictions are rooted in ignorance. And specifically the ignorance that is misapprehending reality, that doesn't see things as dependently arising, that thinks that they independently exist. So this is what's driving the whole show. The root of ignorance, all the other delusions that come from that, and then of course the karma we create that causes us to be reborn in these realms and have these various experiences. So that's the second noble truth. The first two truths, again, are the Buddha just being a good doctor and saying, guess what? You're not well. You've got an illness. It's called samsara, and you are suffering from it. You've got dukkha, this unsatisfactory state. And there are causes to it. And those causes need to be eliminated if you ever want a state of wellness. And that's the third noble truth, is the state of wellness. Before we get to that, though, I think there's a little quote here that pertains to the first two. A sutra states, what is the Arya truth of the origination of suffering? It is recurrent craving, consisting of an attachment one delights in, as well as an attitude which takes pleasure, now here and now there. Because it is kind of our default mode. From the moment we wake up generally till the moment we go to bed, we're always just looking for something to, you know, give me pleasure, give me entertainment, give me whatever. I mean, I want to feel good, right? Most beings are driven by that. We can see it quite easily in our culture as well as even animals, right? They're always looking for something that will satisfy them. Hummingbirds going from one thing to another, you know, I've just got to find that nectar that'll, you know, satisfy my craving. So then the next line, this craving is called vast because it is the cause for all births into existence. And as we saw last week in the 12 links, craving and grasping are these forms of attachment that are key in us being reborn into another existence. Okay, the third noble truth, the total cessation of this suffering and its origination is the truth of cessation, which itself is liberation. So again, at the level of someone who is simply trying to achieve their own liberation or nirvana, they need to have a cessation of what are called the afflictive obscurations, which are ignorance, attachment, craving, all the other delusions that arise on the basis of that. Those need to be removed. And they are removed initially, starting on the path of seeing and throughout the path of meditation, more and more removed until they remove the subtlest level of those and they attain their own nirvana. They become what we call an arhat. An arhat is a foe destroyer. They've destroyed the foes of the afflictions. Now, those on the Mahayana path will do that work as well. They will remove those because you have to get rid of your own garbage first before you can, really go on to achieve Buddhahood and what have you. But there's said to be these 10 grounds that cover from the path of seeing through the end of the path of meditation. On the first 7 grounds, they do that work. And then on the last 3 grounds is where they remove what are called the knowledge obscurations. The knowledge obscurations are the very subtle imprints in our minds that give rise to the false appearance of things. Everything around us, everything that appears to our senses, that appears to our thought consciousness, everything is imbued with this false appearance. Everything seems to exist on its own. Anything I hold up, it's like it has its own entity out here. And of course, we learned what these various things in our world were. And even when we get new objects introduced into our world, like when the iPad was introduced, there was no such phenomenon before that, right? Then we learn the name for it and then it absorbs into it. Immediately, it appears to be that from its own side. It has its own identity. That false appearance is what's blocking you from becoming a Buddha. But you have to first remove the coarser stuff, all the ignorance and everything else, the afflictive obscurations. Then you can do the work on these subtler obscurations that are blocking you from being an omniscient being. And that's what we need to remove eventually, is those imprints that give rise to that false appearance, which then causes the false appearance to fall away. And then we have this mind that is unbounded. You no longer have anything obstructing your mind. So again, cessation has different meanings depending upon whether we're talking about an individual path or the path of the Mahayana, the universal path. But this is essentially what we're talking about with this third noble truth, is there can be an end, just like the doctor saying, guess what? You can attain a perfect state of health. Yeah, you've got an illness, and yeah, there are causes to it, but guess what? There's a cure. And of course, the path is the actual cure, is the medicine we need to take to achieve that state of well-being. So that right about the middle of the screen, the path to its attainment is the 8-limbed Arya path we just described. 4 those limbs join one to the path bringing nirvana's attainment. Again, as they're presented in the typical kind of individual vehicle teachings, these are how you attain your own nirvana. But as I said, they're not really divorced from what the bodhisattvas practice. We just do it with bodhicitta motivation and add on some additional practices, and it will help you to achieve not just your own nirvana, but what's called non-abiding nirvana. I'll explain that term now, even though we're going to talk about the Mahayana path in a short while. Non-abiding nirvana is the goal of the bodhisattva. Yeah, you will attain a nirvana. You will be free, absolutely, from all the garbage in your own mind. You won't have to be reborn through the force of your karma and delusion. But you don't want to abide in kind of the solitary peace that those who attain arhat should do. Remember, I think we've introduced this term nirvana with remainder and without remainder. I think in one of the classes just a short while ago. When you're on the Hinayana path and you attain this state of arhatship, you're still embodied, right? You still have a physical body. When you die, you go into the state of solitary peace. It must be a very blissful place to be, but for a bodhisattva, that's like toxic. That's not where you want to go. You don't want to be stuck in this state of solitary peace where you can't help other beings. So you don't want to abide in that, but you also don't want to abide in samsara and still be stuck in the mire of garbage that everyone else is stuck in, because how can you possibly help them in that case? So you attain what's called a non-abiding nirvana. It doesn't abide in either of these extremes. The extreme of solitary peace that the individual vehicle people check out into, nor the extreme of samsara that we're all still in and bogged down by, right? So non-abiding nirvana is that final state that we want to attain, that all beings eventually will attain. But nirvana as a more temporary goal, temporal goal, is certainly there for those of that disposition. So now 115a, that being so, what we just talked about in regard to these Four Noble Truths, strive always in order to see the four Arya truths. These four Arya truths are what is to be realized. We realize true dukkha, or suffering, eschewed or eliminated. That's the true origins of our dukkha, causes of it. Manifested, in that we have to manifest the cessation, have to actualize it. And fourthly, the path, you have to rely upon it, you have to cultivate it. Again, it's a wonderful teaching on dependent arising right there too. We have reasons that things that are part of why we are experiencing dukkha that are presented, all the causes of that we looked at in a sense through the 12 links of dependent origination. Then we have, of course, the causes that give rise to the cessation of that, our attainment of nirvana. Everything depends upon its, respective causes and conditions. You're never going to attain the state of nirvana or enlightenment without the causes and conditions that give rise to that. So, since the described four truths are such, one should ever exert oneself in meditation so as to see through these four Arya truths reality. Because in a relative sense, these four exist as Arya or noble truths. They are so named, because that's how they exist, that's why they're named that. Just as an accurate term, for example, might be referred to as a noble term. I don't know what that's probably referring to the Sanskrit idea of that. It can be otherwise explained that they are Arya truths because their correctness has been seen by the Aryas. That's usually how I hear the explanation of why they're called Arya truths, is that they are seen for what they are by those who are Aryas, are noble beings who have experienced that direct insight into emptiness. Now we get into some very light advice. So this is going to go rather quickly. We won't have too much explanation, a little bit on the Mahayana path that I'll talk about, but this Venerable Randawa says, well, how can one, as a layman, like the king, remember, who Nagarjuna is writing this whole text for, engaged in the governing of a kingdom, see the truth? I mean, how can somebody who is like totally preoccupied with their day job, of being in charge of a kingdom, actually see the truth? Because seeing the truth depends upon an individual's own effort, one should not become discouraged. So we get some words of encouragement. In verse 115b, the second part of this. Even those householders in whose laps rest great worldly riches can, through knowledge, cross the river of the mental afflictions. It's kind of nice, Nagarjuna saying, don't worry, you've got a lot of stuff to do, a lot of things on your plate. You got to, manage all of this kingdom and what have you, but you still can do it. Even such laymen as King Bimbisara, who lived at the time of the Buddha, in whose lap rested the riches of a kingdom, as well as the riches of a son and so forth, saw the truth and crossed over the river of the mental afflictions by means of right knowledge. You, O king, must do the same. So he's kind of saying, hey, this other king didn't have a problem, at the time of the Buddha. Well, you're a king too, you can do the same. I mean, I think it's nice that he gives us these words of encouragement, but there is going to be more kind of tacked on to this. But I think that can be a big struggle for many of us. And as those of you who've been involved in Tibetan Buddhism for a long time, even other branches of Buddhism, know it's a very complex path. There are a lot of aspects to it. And here, when you tack on Tantra on top of all the sutra that we've been looking at, then it sounds even more complex. But I mean, again, we are going to see some advice that Nagarjuna is giving us a bit more specifically, but the idea is that we just do the best that we can. Don't get too discouraged thinking, oh, it's overwhelming and I just throw my hands up and give up. That's the worst thing we can do. Find what you can work with, what you can do with the time that you have, and try to dedicate the time very well to achieving what you can with this life. Most of us are going to probably take a number of lifetimes to achieve enlightenment. And that's okay. It takes as long as it takes. Tantra's taught us the path for those who don't want to wait because they see that others are suffering while they're unenlightened. well, that's nice, but we still, it might take us a while to get there. So just be okay with that. So the following verse is stated to demonstrate that the Arya path is achieved through an individual's own efforts. Further, those who gained realization of Dharma did not fall from the sky nor sprout from the ground like crops. They were before just ordinary persons like us, subject to the mental afflictions, right? Where do these realized beings come from? Where did the Buddha come from? Buddha was an ordinary sentient being just like us. I think it's real comforting to think in that way because then, we don't think that this kind of realm of these extraordinary beings that we see, even the ones we see in our world, like His Holiness or Lama Zopa Rinpoche or whoever it is that we kind of look at as an exemplar of great progress on the path. We don't think that they're in some other league. Yes, they are now in terms of what they've achieved, but we can do the same. They were exactly as us. They were as deluded and crazy as we are, right? And we just have to do the work. Again, put the exertion, the effort into it. And by all means, we can achieve it. They say once the causes and conditions are in place, you'll be forced into enlightenment, essentially. Enlightenment will happen, whether you want it to or not. However many Aryas, those who have perceived the Four Truths directly, have appeared, not one of them has been so from the beginning. They neither fell from the sky nor rose up from the ground like crops, but were formerly ordinary persons dominated by the mental afflictions. Later, through a spiritual teacher, they were able to pursue the path and become Aryas. Thus, you too must exert yourself without becoming discouraged in pursuit of the path. So, again, I don't need to say much about that. I think it's pretty clear. Verse 117, what need to preach much to the fearless? Subdue your mind. This is the most useful and essential of instructions. The Bhagavan said, mind is the root of Dharma. When I first read this, I was reminded of the prayer that sometimes when we do longer prayers before teachings, like when we have lamas and what have you, we recite this. That is, the wording's a little different than the one that I'm used to reciting. This is in the FPMT prayer book. Do not commit any unwholesome actions. Engage in perfect wholesome actions. Subdue one's own mind. I used to say subdue one's mind thoroughly, right? Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. So to the degree, this is maybe some kinder advice perhaps, to the degree that we can at least abide by these three as much as possible. Stop committing all the garbage actions, the stupid things that we talked about, the 10 non-virtues way at the beginning of this course. Stop doing these actions that harm others and yourself. That's already amazing. I think I may have shared this here, but I'll share it again. I heard once, and I don't remember who said this, but I heard that Rinpoche, in talking to a group of FPMT center directors, what have you, he made the statement, in effect, that if the FPMT existed and all that happened was one person turned away from killing, it would be worth it to have the whole organization there, just to have one person stop killing. That's like the first of the 10 non-virtues, right? It's said to be the worst, but even just one person not killing any longer is huge. So if you've taken any of these vows or any you've committed to not engaging in these 10 virtues, any of them, any degree of them, pat yourself on the back. You've done a good job. Keep doing the work, keep moving in that direction, but recognize that this is the essential teaching. The first one, to stop doing these actions that are harmful. Secondly, engage in wholesome actions. Kindness, generosity, compassion. Stop avoiding killing, and doing more to protect life, doing more to protect the possessions of others, to always, try to uphold good morality in all of our behavior. But the third one is the harder one. Subdue your mind thoroughly. Well, we have to really do a lot of hard work to look at our own minds. But if we become more mindful, have our introspection kind of operative in our lives, we can become much better at controlling our thoughts, not allowing our thoughts to carry us away to all of these horrible places. So this is the essence of what the Buddha taught. Let's go back to what this verse says. It's essentially the same advice, even though it's not that exact line that I just read from that prayer that we sometimes do. So the king, free of worry that others might oppose him, is addressed as fearless. So the Nagarjuna is giving him a epithet of fearless here. What need is there to preach at great length? Indeed, it is unnecessary.
The primary and most essential instruction of benefit in both a temporal and ultimate sense is this: subdue the mind by turning it away from non-virtue and engaging it in virtue. So all three of those are all incorporated there, right? Subdue your mind, through also making sure you don't engage in non-virtue and you try to practice virtue as much as possible. In this way, all acts of body, speech, and mind, or three doors, will become virtuous. The Bhagavan has declared that the world is produced by mind. That's because through our mind and our thoughts, we create karma, and those get manifested physically and verbally as well. So the world is produced by mind, it is brought into being by the mind. All things follow from the influence of a single thing, mind. In addition, good is the subdual of the mind. Subduing the mind brings happiness. And this is really what the Buddha taught, right? That's why we have that wonderful little verse. This is the teaching of the Buddha. Subdue your mind, folks. Sounds simple, 3 words. Subdue your mind. Okay, the following verse is stated to indicate that not only does one abide properly in the teaching of the Buddha through practicing all that has been explained here, accomplishing even part of the instruction is meaningful. This is a bit of what I was saying earlier, right? We don't have to do all of this in this lifetime. We don't have to get all the 6 perfections down and all the other teachings and totally renounced and bodhicitta that's spontaneous and da 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 da. I mean, these will happen over time, but do what you can. So the verse says, to accomplish all this teaching given you would be difficult even for a monk or a nun, somebody who's fully ordained and living the life of a monastic, separate from society to some degree, not having the regular routine and responsibilities of a lay person. Bring meaning to your life by developing the good qualities of whichever instructions you practice. I know there's a lot of them, and this is why it's good to have gurus and teachers that we can rely upon to some degree, that we can gain some direction from. And if you feel kind of overwhelmed, like, oh my God, this course talked about a zillion things and I don't have any idea where to even start, well, then spend some time with a teacher and perhaps get some advice about how to work with this. Now, again, we haven't gone through all these teachings in the normal Lam Rim kind of way. The Lam Rim is very much a structure for starting here, at point A and ending up at point Z, and so you follow it through step by step. So that is a very wonderful format that we can rely upon, that we can go to and say, okay, this is exactly where I just have to start where I am. Start with just entering at ground level and begin to work on developing realizations of these, topics. Put realizations in quotes, maybe not deep realizations, but some understanding of them and some incorporating them into our lives. But then gurus can also give us more specific instructions and things that we should be working with that might be very good for our minds. So again, don't think that you're out there on your own, completely apart from, in the middle of nowhere with nobody to give you any guidance. There are beings who can do this. Geshe Sherab, who will be coming here next week, I think is an excellent person to go to for this sort of spiritual advice. And I know that some of you in the room do that because he is such a wonderful teacher and so approachable, easy to talk to, so don't get intimidated talking to him, have proper respect and what have you, but he's very down to earth, those of you who don't know him. So it says, O king, to practice in its entirety all that has been instructed in these words would be difficult indeed even for a monk who engages exclusively in virtuous activities. Needless to say, a layman or lay person diverted by many responsibilities would find it so. So recognize it. We don't have the karma, most of us listening to these teachings, certainly all of you in the Gompa right now and online are not ordained. We don't have the luxury of living in a life, but these days, I think ordained people don't live that kind of a secluded life anyway. Many of them work for centers and are just as busy as all of us, right? But if you do have the leisure at some point in your lifetime to be somewhat in seclusion and not having to engage in day-to-day activities, but to be solely focused on Dharma practice, you can do that as a layperson or an unordained person. But the idea is that most of us don't have that situation right now. So we just look at our lives and we make the decisions of what we're going to engage in, and we do the best that we can, and it'll all be worthwhile. There is nothing virtuous that we waste our time on. It's all good stuff. It'll all ripen into future experiences that will continue your path of virtue
to liberation and enlightenment. Nevertheless, whichever of these instructions you make the essence of your practice, bring meaning to your life, habituating yourself to the eschewal of non-virtue and the cultivation of virtue. In doing so, you abide in the teaching of the Buddha and gradually come to acquire all other virtues as well. I think I've got time to read. Maybe this is better even at the end, but this is where Geshe Sopa does make a little bit of advice about how to live our lives. Let's see, it's the blue tab here. After verse 118, this is pages 318 and 19. He says, even someone who has renounced the activities of this life would find it difficult to practice all these techniques completely at one time. This is even more the case for lay people. Nevertheless, you can do some of these practices. Some of them are suitable for you. You should learn what is right and what is wrong. You know, it's not a value judgment. It's what is going to lead us to happiness, what is going to lead us to more suffering. You should do whatever it is possible for you to do. You may not be able to do everything, but do as much as you can. There are so many faults you can work on eliminating. You can try to give up killing, stealing, lying, and so forth. If you can't work on them all at once, work on what you can. You can work on developing your positive mental, verbal, and physical qualities. As much as you can, try to help others, develop compassion, and become accustomed to the positive side. If you live your life this way, abiding in the Buddhist teachings, your life will be useful. You will gradually achieve higher and higher spiritual goals. So please engage in this way of practicing the common path. So again, I thought that was very kind of Geshe Sopa to kind of give us that real down-to-earth advice, which, again, don't get overwhelmed and feel like, oh my God, I can't possibly do all of this in this life. Everything is positive in creating an imprint, and those things we can dedicate more time to are well worth it. It makes your life meaningful and useful. Now, we're going to go on to the section where we unite all of this with the Mahayana, which we've been talking about indirectly throughout this anyway, seeing it from that perspective. And this last part is called Pursuing What is the Mahayana Path, together with its result. Now, that would be like the whole Lam Rem, if we were to go into it in detail, but instead, we're going to just touch on these teachings. There are as well 2 sections to this final chapter. The first is that of the path's activities. The listener's mind having been satisfied through the presentation of Dharma in the foregoing chapters, the following verses are stated with the intention of introducing him or her to the Mahayana path. Again, the Mahayana path goes one step further, a big step, to achieving enlightenment for the sake of all beings, rather than just one's own liberation. So, first topic is the activities of the path, three verses. First, two activities are really important. Rejoice at all the virtue of all beings. Rejoicing is an incredibly meritorious practice. And dedicate your own threefold good deeds, body, speech, and mind, to the attainment of Buddhahood. We do that at the end of all of our classes, and we're meant to do that at the end of all of our virtuous activities. Then, with this mass of virtue, become a master of yoga in all the worlds of gods and humans. They don't mean yoga like the yoga, like hatha yoga and all these things people are. Yoga is the joining of our minds together with the Buddha's practices through our own engagement in them. It's the word yoga actually comes from the Sanskrit meaning to yoke, to tie together our minds in the activity. So it's any of the practices, meditations, and so on that we engage in. So become a master of yoga in all the worlds of gods and humans, those good rebirths we have, for an immeasurable number of births. Again, hopefully it won't be immeasurable, but we'll attain, and as many as we need to practice the path to Buddhahood. And protect many helpless beings with activities like those of Arya Avalokiteshvara. This is the Buddha of compassion, who was, dedicated to helping sentient beings, freeing them from their suffering. In a final birth, dispel sickness, aging, desire, and hatred. Then, in a Buddha field, become, as did Lord Amitabha, the guardian of the world, with a lifespan of infinite length. So again, you become the guardian of the world in a Buddha field, kind of manifesting that Buddha field for the sake of all sentient beings. So let's take a look at these teachings. First, the topic of rejoicing.
rejoice, saying the following words, just as the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas rejoice at all virtue, both the impure of ordinary beings and the pure virtue of Aryas, so too do I rejoice. I talk a little bit briefly about rejoicing. Rejoicing is said to, when we rejoice in our own actions, of course, this helps us to have more enthusiasm for virtue, right? Because we go, oh, I rejoice that I actually did something meaningful with my day today. I came to class, or last Thursday when we did activities around, Sakadawa. We can rejoice in those. And we rejoice in others' activities. We take delight in what they have and their abilities to do good deeds. And of course, you want to rejoice in the holy beings, the Aryas, and so on. This is an amazing practice. So try to cultivate it as much as possible. It's said to increase the merits that you create, and you gain a portion of the merits that others create that you are rejoicing in. Then it says, dedicate as well all your three types of good deeds, those of body, speech, and mind, to the attainment of Buddhahood, saying, by this virtue may I become a guardian for those beings who have no guardian, a savior for those who have no savior. Of course, this is implying bodhicitta motivation, right? We dedicate with the intention that we are going to become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And we continually motivate with that at the beginning and dedicate at the end, so that everything that we create in the middle is dedicated for that result, is kind of protected for that result. So these are very important practices of a bodhisattva. Not that they aren't, used by other practitioners, but for the bodhisattva in particular that needs to attain an incredible amount of merit to become a Buddha, well, then you need to dedicate constantly, as well as, of course, create the virtue that you dedicate, but you can rejoice in others' virtue as well, just to gain a portion of what they've, accumulated. The verse next advises that one should, with the mass of virtue acquired from rejoicing and dedicating, generate a lifetime of infinite length through remaining the guardian of the world until samsara is emptied. So the idea here is that we do want to eventually attain a state of kind of becoming immortal, eternal, as a Buddha. We need to engage in what rebirths that we have, just to have the good situation, the good conditions to be able to practice. But the idea here too is that we do need to eventually attain a state where we will be able to abide forever for the sake of all sentient beings, as it says there, until samsara is emptied. What must one do before this comes about, that actual result? It comes about after one has brought the qualities of a Buddha to completion and sentient beings to maturity. We do have to some degree ripen others. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to get all beings to become Buddhas before we become a Buddha. That's the Bodhisattva ideal, but that's not how it actually happens. But we have to kind of plant the seeds for others to ripen into their Buddhahood as well. The first of these two activities is done in the following manner. During the period in which one is pursuing the path, one takes birth in the worlds of deities and humans for an immeasurable number of lives and proceeds to master the yogas. Here, the yogas that are mentioned specifically are the yoga of Dharani. Dharani is kind of it's a Sanskrit word that means to kind of hold or maintain. And the idea is they hold the essence of a teaching. They're like mantras in a sense, but they can be repeated and kind of used like mantras. And eventually we kind of generate the same things that are imbued in that Dharani. Dharanis are often more like passages of words from sutras and things, but they're said to have the power to heal and protect from harm. So you work with these Dharanis and other mantras and samadhi and all the other practices, which have inconceivably great qualities. That's how we actually bring the qualities of a Buddha to completion. Concerning the second practice of bringing sentient beings to maturity, one should protect many helpless beings with activities comparable to those of Arya Avalokiteshvara, who has saved such beings from the threat of lions, elephants, and the like. Through this, the accumulations of virtue and wisdom are completed. So this is the essence of our path. We do everything we can to ripen our own qualities and then to help others, so that they can get on that path of ripening and awakening as well. Next, having taken birth in one's final existence as a sentient being, one should rid oneself of illness and aging, subsumed within the truth of suffering, as well as of desire, hatred, and so forth that are subsumed within the truth of the origination of suffering or dukkha. Where is this done? Where do you actually complete that?
And in many of the Mahayana teachings, they talk about kind of, that you are creating the cause for a Buddha field. That is the ripening of your own virtue. It's done in a Buddha field. It's kind of consummated in a Buddha field, which has been purified through one's own rudiments of virtue. How is it done? One is to acquire a field, retinue, lifespan, and so forth, in the same way as the Bhagawan Amitabha, the Buddha of limitless light, who attained Buddhahood in the Buddha field of Sukhavati. So what happens is that when you attain Buddhahood, you kind of simultaneously, as you cross over into what's again called of these 5 paths, it's the path of no more learning, you attain at that very moment, instantaneously, your fully ripened Buddha field, where the Sambhoga Kaya aspect, the enjoyment body, manifests and abides there with a retinue and beings that you will be teaching to, superior beings. But anyway, and then you also immediately manifest as emanation bodies, Nirmanakaya, that are available for accessing other beings, for beings to be able to receive the teachings and guidance that they need, who are not Arya beings, Arya Bodhisattvas. Okay, so that's kind of in a nutshell what happens on the Mahayana. As I said, there's a lot more that happens on the Mahayana, but we've touched on some of those things here and there. The following 2 verses are stated to illustrate that after attaining Buddhahood and acting appropriately on behalf of sentient beings, one should attain nirvana. This is a little confusing to me because technically you've already attained nirvana when you become a Buddha, right? You've attained your non-abiding nirvana. Anyway, I'll read a little the verses from Geshe Sopa because I think they're a little bit clearer. This is the last topic in the entire text, the result of the path in the last 2 verses. Having achieved the stage of victory, which pacifies human earthlings and divine celestial youths delighting in sense pleasures, and extinguishes fear, birth, and death for multitudes of helpless, afflicted beings, spread the fame of immaculate wisdom, morality, and generosity throughout the celestial region, space, and upon the face of the earth. Finally, attain the transcendent state of name only, peace, fearlessness, unsullied, and perfect. Now, one way you could interpret this, which was my initial thinking about it, but again, I'll read Geshe Sopa's, was that when samsara is finally emptied, which is kind of probably a bit in the future, because we have to have all beings. I mean, it's mind-blowing how many beings there must be, right? Because even to think about the beings that exist in this world, just the humans, like almost 8 billion, that's like beyond the scope. But the idea is that when you actually are able to finally, through the force of all these enlightened beings, samsara becomes emptied, well, then you kind of exit into a state of peace, it would seem, right? Because the work's done, right? Not that it's work per se, because when you become a Buddha, it's done spontaneously, effortlessly, without any thought even. You're just there as this wish-fulfilling jewel for beings to help them to get enlightened. But the idea is that there is this sort of, you don't extinguish really, you go into a state of complete peace at that point. And there's nothing left to do, right? There's no worlds that are being created by beings because there's no beings that are creating those worlds. It's kind of weird to think about. You might think, oh, that sounds kind of strange, but I think it'd be such a blissful state, and you'd be like united with the minds of all other beings. So I don't know if that's what it's referring to, but let me read what Geshe Sopa has. I know I'm coming down to my last few minutes here, but we will get done tonight. This is on page 331. This is how he, or 330 and 331, this is how he translated these verses. He said, through extending the stainless eminence of your wisdom, morality, and generosity throughout the heavens, the sky, and on earth, you engage in pacifying those who enjoy sense pleasures, humans on earth and the superb youths of the God realms. Having attained the state of a Lord of the Victors, a Buddha, you calm many weak and ignorant beings' fear, birth, and death. May you attain the fearless, unadulterated, faultless state of the peace simply called gone beyond sorrow. So it kind of ends with like just maybe Nagarjuna's own wish for the king or whoever's reading this to attain that in the last 2 lines, rather than saying that you attain nirvana after attaining Buddhahood, which doesn't make sense again, unless we're talking about some sort of passing into nirvana at the tail end of all of the emptying of samsara. So let's read what our text says, which I think is probably a bit more in line with what Geshe Sopa says as well. And then we will conclude the text for this course. Having achieved, what's it going to put that up a little bit. Having achieved the stage of victory, attain the state of nirvana, which is transcendent in that the impure heaps are terminated in their entirety. This nirvana is of name only because it is not real, meaning not real in the sense of having inherent existence. Name only, merely imputed. Peace because there is no harm, and fearlessness because there's no fear. It is unsullied because it's without impurity, perfect because it is without change. What sort of victorious stage must be achieved before this is attained? This nirvana is attained after one has achieved the victorious stage which disheartens the heedless, who delight in the joys of sensory pleasures, be they humans living upon the earth or exalted youths comprising the 6 classes of desire gods, and pacifies them by establishing them in the preliminaries of the Arya path, morality and so forth, and in the Arya path itself, both the preliminaries and the path itself. It is as well the stage which distinguishes the fear derived primarily from our ignorance, its grasping at the aggregates, this perishable base as a real I, birth, which is derived primarily from ignorance, karma, and desire, and death, produced by the exhaustion of karma in one's lifespan and by one's not having eschewed anger, of the multitude of sentient beings tortured by the mental afflictions and tormented by suffering. So he does kind of seem to be talking about when we are able to help all beings to attain that level of freedom, that then there's some sort of entering into nirvana, but it's not real clear from this. And Geshe-Sopa's commentaries seem more in line with how he worded those verses. One may ask, what must be done before entering nirvana? One should enter nirvana after having spread the fame of perfect wisdom, which discerns absolutely reality's true condition, of perfect morality, which has the qualities of being uncorrupted and such, and of perfect generosity or liberality, as it was called in this text, which is free from attachment towards anything, throughout the worlds of the celestial realms, of the intervening sky, and of humans upon the earth. So again, I think Geshe-Sopa's makes a bit more sense in terms of talking about those last 2 lines. It's like Nagarjuna saying, well, then may you attain this state. And of course, that's the state of Buddhahood, which is the non-abiding nirvana. There is a closing set of verses that come from Venerable Vrindavan, and I'll just read these and I won't say much at all about them. The lotus of good sayings from the water treasure of scriptures kept by the Nagas is a source for the honey of virtue. It should be opened with the sun rays of intellect and enjoyed by a swarm of fortunate bee-like persons. We should try to get all the honey, the nectar we can, right? As long as the good word of the Muni's speech and the sayings of great persons are proclaimed in this world, this realm will have a true guardian and remain beautiful, with sunlight shining in an unblemished sky. But as the forces of the flower-arrowed one, destroyer of virtue, increase, the Muni's teaching becoming obscure like the waning of a person's life, and the multitude straying from the Dharma path of peace, those desirous of virtue should rely single-mindedly on the path of virtue. This is referring to the fact that it is said that the teachings do decline in a world system. When the Buddha comes, there's about 5,000 years, and every 500 there's like a new milestone in terms of the teachings declining and it becoming more difficult to practice. So he concludes then with these wonderful lines, may the pure virtue acquired by my present endeavor, and we can think about that for each of us, white as the pollen of the Kamuda and the lotus, enable beings to cross the river of erroneous views and reach the land of deliverance. So again, this last little bit is not really complete in terms of spelling out the whole Mahayana path and how to achieve it and everything else. But as I said, we've touched on a number of topics and I've tried to insert where I could in Mahayana understanding. But hopefully that bit of advice that was given by Geshe-Sopa will be useful to you in terms of looking at everything we've gone through and recognizing, yeah, I can't possibly practice it all, but at least I can do what I can right now. So. Any questions or comments before we conclude?
Congratulations.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have to run through the last few verses like sometimes happens, but. Any questions, comments?
Well, I rejoice.
We can all rejoice.
Thank you so much.
Any
You're
questions
wonderful.
online?
Thank you.
No. I'm happy to share this text. This is interesting because I mean, I've never taught this text before. And the reason why I decided was because of Geshe Sopa's commentary, because his books are always so excellent in terms of his explanations and everything that is brought into them. And so I've enjoyed having the opportunity to be able to study this text in more detail. But those of you who study Lam Rim, and certainly like Liberation, the Palm of Your Hand, many of the verses we touched on are cited there, right? Because this is a big source of a lot of the teachings. Remember, in the Lam Rim, the first two are really primarily the Hinayana path, and so a lot of the verses are there. And then from some of other Nagarjuna's texts are the verses that pertain to the great scope, the Mahayana. But enjoy your teachings with Geshe-la. I hear he's going to be doing teachings on the 8 verses starting next week. This is a wonderful text in the Mahayana tradition solely, based, of course, on other teachings as well around karma and what have you. But it's so essential to practice that as well as best as you can. So if there are no other questions or comments, then I think we will conclude. Let's go ahead and have the dedications done. If you do have any that you need to add from home, please let us know. Jana will read the list that we have here in the GoPro. Let's see if I can get the camera a little clearer.
We dedicate the merit created by these wonderful teachings to all beings everywhere on every prayer list. We dedicate for those experiencing obstacles, specifically Jane, Adrian, Jenny, Joseph, Lyra, Bobby, Matt, V, Yolanda, Alejandro, Sarah, Norbu, Sheep, the sheep, Duchin, sheep, the sheep, Karma, the sheep, Rosemary P, Aileen H, Joe C, Elena, Yvonne, Jana, Mary, Joe. We also dedicate for those experiencing illness, specifically the mother of Mary Lutz, Dorcas, Jane, Patty, Bill, John, Jim, Carola, John A, Rinchin Norbu, Alex, Aileen, Elena. And we also dedicate for those who are dying or who have died in the last 49 days, those who have died in wars and regional conflicts, Audrey, Marcia, Bella, Bella the dog, Pam, Molly, Hummingbird, Frank M, Cody B, and the insects, and also Julia B, Seth H, and Diane B.
So again, are there any other people who need to be added to the prayer list at this time? Anyone? I assume Adrian's mother is on there, yes?
Jane.
Okay, Jane, yeah, okay, good.
Hello, could you add Alora and Alyssa to obstacles, please? Thank you.
Yeah, but, yeah. Anyone else, anyone that needs to be added?
Julie had set their obstacles, they're not done.
What's that?
Julia and Seth are obstacles. they're not
Juliet.
done. Sorry.
Paying for Julia.
Ran out of space there,
Hmm,
yeah.
Oh, these right here.
okay.
That,
They're on,
they go over there. Okay, got it.
Okay, so for these beings that were on the list, as well as any other beings we're holding in our hearts, we dedicate for the complete removal of their suffering and for them to attain perfect happiness as quickly as possible. And let's do our dedication prayers for tonight. Let's go back to the file here. Put them on the screen, and here we go. Should I later?
We're doing it in Tibetan.
Okay, wonderful.
Gewadi.
Jang Chub Sam Chog Rinpoche, Ma Ke Panam Ke Gyurche, Ke Wanyam Pa Me Panyam, Gong Me Gong Du Pel Wan Shom.
Long life prayers for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The wish granting which
Source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled.
And for Osohito Lamiyeshi's reincarnation,
Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us, and intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long.
And for the swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche,
Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shavakas and Raktika Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request, while striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for other living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss! Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples.
And thank you all for the opportunity to share this text with all of you. And again, I hope you continue to practice well and study well and enjoy the teachings with Geshe Sherab. By the way, when I was talking about like getting advice from a guru or a teacher, that's an excellent way to do it, is to drive him back and forth, because you get to talk to him the whole time. So, so know that there's that option, you know, besides meeting with him when he is up here as well, or, you know, what have you. But all right, thank you all again. I
Thank
really
you, Don
appreciate
Well.
all of you.
Thank you.
It was great being with all of you these last, 5 months. So I look forward to the next time whenever that happens. So thank you.
Wonderful.
thank you.
Thank you. Otherwise, everybody. Oh, you're welcome, Stella. Thank you.